She slept on church steps for 3 days, until the prince whispered, "I'll keep you safe." The bells toll over a silent town square. A starving young woman, wrapped in rags, refuses to leave the cold stone steps of the chapel. Townsfolk spit, servants whisper, and nobles ride by without mercy until one man, cloaked in velvet, kneels beside her. He offers safety, but safety in a palace of silk and lies is never what it seems. Behind gilded doors, whispers sharpen into knives. A hidden betrothal, a jealous court lady, and a secret from her bloodline threaten to shatter everything. She was once scorned as a beggar. Now, her presence could ruin a prince or redeem a kingdom. But when love defies the crown, when secrets rise like storm clouds over the altar, will mercy and truth be enough to save them both? Comment below, and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The autumn wind whistled through the square of street. Florian as dawn's first light painted the mountains in soft purple hues. Church bells tolled, their deep bronze voices echoing off the stone buildings that lined the town square. Clara Mueller pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to find warmth on the cold church steps where she had spent the night. Her fingers traced the delicate stitches of her mother's last embroidery, a cherished scrap of fabric that remained her only comfort. Market day was beginning, and townsfolk hurried past with baskets and carts. Clara could smell fresh bread from the baker's shop, making her empty stomach ache with renewed intensity. 3 nights without proper shelter had left her weak and weary, yet she held herself with quiet dignity despite her ragged appearance. "Poor thing," whispered a vegetable seller to her neighbor as they set up their stalls. "That's Heinrich Mueller's niece, isn't it?" "Aye," came the sharp reply, loud enough for Clara to hear. "The debtor's orphan. Her uncle gambled away everything, even the roof over her head. Serves the family right, putting on such airs all these years." Clara bowed her head, letting her dark hair fall forward to hide the tears that threatened. The words stung, but they held painful truth. Her uncle's reckless dealings had indeed cost her everything: the modest but comfortable home she'd shared with her mother, their small savings, and even her good name in the town where she'd lived all her 17 years. More villagers gathered in the square as morning progressed. Some cast pitying glances her way, while others whispered behind raised hands, their scorn evident in narrowed eyes and turned backs. A group of well-dressed merchants' wives passed by, their skirts swishing as they gave her a wide berth. "Disgraceful," one muttered, "sleeping on holy ground like a common beggar." Clara closed her eyes and prayed silently, her mother's words echoing in her memory. "Keep faith, my dear one. God sees beyond circumstances to the truth of our hearts." The embroidered fabric in her hands was her mother's final gift, delicate roses and vines, stitched with such skill that they seemed almost alive. The work spoke of noble training, though Clara had never understood how her mother learned such fine needlework. The sacristan emerged from the church's side door, his keys jangling at his belt. Upon seeing Clara, his weathered face creased with disapproval. "You cannot stay here, girl. These steps are not your bed." "Please, sir," Clara said softly, her voice hoarse from cold and hunger. "I have nowhere else to go. Surely God's house offers shelter to all who seek it." The old man's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. "The bishop would not approve. You must find somewhere else." But Clara remained where she was, her shoulders straight despite her trembling. The church steps were indeed her last refuge. She had tried the inn, but they wanted payment in advance. The hospice was full with fever patients. Even the stable masters had turned her away, fearing she might steal. As day faded into dusk, the square gradually emptied. The wind grew sharper, and Clara huddled closer to the church wall, studying the intricate embroidery by the last light of day. Her mother had taught her the same delicate stitches, though they had never been able to afford the fine silks and metallic threads that would have made their work truly valuable. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones roused her from half-sleep. A magnificent carriage rolled quietly through the square, its black lacquered surface gleaming in the gathering darkness. It came to a stop before the church, and a tall figure emerged, wrapped in a fine wool cloak. Clara blinked drowsily as the nobleman approached the steps. He paused at the sight of her, and she found herself gazing into eyes that seemed to hold both authority and unexpected kindness. Even in the dimness, she recognized Prince Leopold, whom she had glimpsed once during a festival procession. The prince stood very still, studying her with quiet intensity. Clara knew she should look away, that a girl of her station had no right to meet such a gaze directly. Yet, something in his expression held her frozen, like a deer in torchlight, as the evening shadows deepened around them. The heavy church doors creaked open, spilling golden candlelight onto the frost-dusted steps. Clara scrambled to her feet, clutching her mother's embroidery clothes as she tried to slip away into the shadows. Her heart pounded. She had endured enough scolding from the townsfolk these past days. But before she could escape, Prince Leopold stepped forward, his fine cloak sweeping the stone steps as he knelt beside her. Clara froze, unsure whether to curtsy or flee. His presence was commanding, yet his eyes held none of the coldness she expected from nobility. "Please, do not run," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll keep you safe." Clara's hands trembled. "Your Highness, I cannot accept charity. 'Tis not proper." "There is nothing proper about leaving God's children to freeze on church steps," Leopold replied. He turned to his valet, who stood discreetly in the doorway. "Bring food from the castle kitchen, and fetch my spare traveling cloak." "At once, Your Highness." The valet bowed and disappeared into the pre-dawn gloom. Clara's cheeks burned with shame as her stomach growled traitorously. "My lord, I should not." "Come," Leopold interrupted gently. "The morning air bites sharp as winter's teeth. Let us warm ourselves by the church candles while we wait." He offered his arm as if she were a fine lady, not a beggar in threadbare clothes. Clara hesitated, then placed her trembling hand in the crook of his elbow. Together they entered the church, their footsteps echoing in the silent nave. The interior was hushed and dim, scented with beeswax and incense. Dozens of candles flickered before the altar, their light dancing across the painted saints in their niches. Leopold guided her to a bench near the warmth of the flames. "Your needlework," he said, nodding to the fabric she still clutched. "The stitching is extraordinarily fine." Clara smoothed the piece with reverent fingers. "My mother taught me, before she—" Her voice caught. "She said every stitch should be a prayer, a beautiful thought." His eyes studied her face with unexpected gentleness. "And rare skill. Our castle sewing hall has need of such talented hands." The valet returned, bearing a basket of fresh bread and cheese, and a thick wool cloak lined with fur. The smell of food made Clara dizzy with hunger, though she tried to hide it. "Please," Leopold said, "eat something. And take the cloak, it will serve you better than it serves my closet." Clara's resistance crumbled as he draped the warm garment around her shoulders. She took a small bite of bread, then another, struggling to maintain proper manners despite her desperate hunger. Leopold spoke quietly with his valet and the churchwarden, who had appeared to prepare for morning prayers. Clara caught fragments of their conversation, arrangements being made, assurances given. The bells began to toll prime hour, their deep voices calling the faithful to prayer. Leopold returned to where Clara sat, still savoring each careful bite of bread. "The churchwarden's wife will escort you to the castle," he said. "There is honest work in the sewing hall for those with skill and dedication." Clara's heart fluttered with hope, though caution tempered it. "Your Highness is too kind, but—" She hesitated. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because kindness should not be a stranger in any Christian land," he replied simply. "Will you trust me enough to accept?" She looked into his earnest face, so different from the cold masks worn by most nobles she had glimpsed. The churchwarden's wife waited by the door, her expression motherly and kind. Clara gathered her courage and stood, wrapping Leopold's cloak more tightly around her shoulders. "Yes, Your Highness. I will trust you." Though her steps were hesitant as she followed the churchwarden's wife toward the door, Clara felt something she had not known in many dark days: hope, fragile as a candle flame, but burning steady in her heart. In the castle's vast sewing hall, Clara sat hunched over her work, morning light streaming through tall windows. Her fingers trembled as she threaded a delicate needle, aware of the curious stares from 24 seamstresses around her. The head seamstress, Frau Weber, had given her a simple piece of linen and silk thread as a test of skill. "Show us what you can do, girl," Frau Weber had said, her tone neither kind nor cruel. "Though I warn you, we serve nobility here. Our standards are high." Clara took a deep breath and began to work. The familiar motion of needle through fabric calmed her racing heart. She chose a pattern her mother had taught her, delicate roses twining around forget-me-nots, each petal shaped by tiny, precise stitches. The other women's chatter faded as she lost herself in the peaceful rhythm of embroidery. Within an hour, gasps of surprise rippled through the sewing hall. Several seamstresses abandoned their own work to gather around Clara's stool. Her flowers seemed to bloom from the fabric itself, each stitch placed with perfect care. "Where did you learn such work?" asked a young apprentice, eyes wide with wonder. "My mother taught me," Clara answered softly, her throat tight with memory. She learned from her mother before her. Frau Weber examined the piece with pursed lips. "This is fine work indeed. Too fine for a beggar girl." But she could not deny Clara's skill, and soon assigned her a place at the window where the light was best. As morning turned to afternoon, whispers filled the hall like rustling leaves. The servants had many questions about the mysterious girl Prince Leopold had brought from the church steps. Some offered Clara gentle smiles and shared their bread at mealtime. Others kept their distance, watching with suspicious eyes. "The prince's charity will bring scandal," one woman muttered to another. "Mark my words." Clara kept her head down, pretending not to hear. But her heart grew heavier with each passing hour. Through the open gallery above the sewing hall, noble voices drifted down. She recognized the sharp tones of courtiers discussing affairs of state. "The Duchess of Saxony arrives within the fortnight," declared a man's voice. "The alliance must be secured through marriage before winter sets in." "Indeed," replied a woman. "Prince Leopold knows his duty. The peace between our lands depends upon this match." Clara's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A drop of blood stained the white linen, bright as the pain in her chest. Of course the prince was promised to another. How foolish she had been to imagine his kindness meant anything more than Christian charity toward a poor soul. When darkness fell, Clara retired to the tiny chamber she had been assigned in the servants' wing. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a single candle, more comfort than she had known in months. Yet tears slipped down her cheeks as she curled beneath the thin blanket. "I cannot stay," she whispered to the shadows. "I will only bring him trouble." The quiet of night settled over the castle. Then, through her door, came the soft notes of a lute. The melody was sweet and sad, drifting down the corridor like a whispered prayer. Clara knew it was Leopold playing. The servants spoke of how he often walked the halls at night, seeking peace in music when sleep would not come. She pressed her hand to the rough wood of the door, letting the gentle song wash over her. They existed in different worlds, separated by birth and duty. His kindness had saved her, but she could not allow it to destroy him. Tomorrow she would find a way to leave quietly, before her presence could spark the scandal everyone feared. But tonight, she let herself listen to his music, each note a tender reminder of the brief moment when a prince had looked upon a beggar with compassion and promised to keep her safe. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the embroidery room, casting golden light across Clara's careful stitches. A week had passed since she first entered the castle, yet each day still felt like a dream that might shatter. Her needle danced through the fine linen of the altar cloth, creating delicate patterns of grapevines and wheat sheaves. The other seamstresses had grown used to her presence, though they still marveled at her skill. Some had even taken to leaving small gifts at her workstation, a ribbon here, a sweet roll there. Their kindness touched her deeply, making the grand castle feel a bit more like home. The door creaked open, and the familiar sound of boots on stone made Clara's heart skip. Prince Leopold entered, his presence filling the room like warmth from a hearth. The seamstresses immediately rose and curtsied. Then with knowing glances, they quietly gathered their work and filed out. "Good morrow, Mistress Müller," Leopold said, his voice carrying the weight of formality despite the softness in his eyes. "I wish to commission a design for a ceremonial stole." Clara dipped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes downcast, though her cheeks warmed. "Your Highness honors me. Please, what design would you prefer?" He moved closer, examining the altar cloth spread before her. "Your work shows such life, such truth." His shoulders seemed to sag slightly, unlike the endless pageantry of court life. Clara's hands stilled on her embroidery. "Does the court not bring you joy, Your Highness?" "Joy?" He gave a quiet laugh. "There is precious little joy in hollow ceremony, in alliances built on nothing but advantage and convenience." He traced the edge of her embroidery with a gentle finger. "This has more honesty in one stitch than I find in 100 courtly bows." Over the next several days, Leopold returned often to the embroidery room. Always there was a reason, a design to approve, a color to choose. Always a servant or lady's maid remained present, seated discreetly by the door. Yet in those quiet moments between discussion of threads and patterns, they shared something deeper. "Tell me of your dreams," he asked her one afternoon, while she worked on the commissioned stole. Clara's needle paused. "Dreams are dangerous things for someone of my station, Your Highness." "Perhaps that makes them more precious," he replied softly. She found herself opening up to him, sharing memories of her mother teaching her to embroider, of quiet evenings by the fire. He, in turn, spoke of the crushing weight of expectations, of wanting to be more than just a title. The servants who chaperoned these meetings began treating Clara with careful kindness. Old Martha, who had served in the castle for 40 years, pulled her aside one morning. "Be careful, child," she whispered, her weathered face creased with concern. "Some of the court ladies have sharp tongues and sharper eyes. They don't like seeing His Highness spend time with a common seamstress, no matter how talented." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "I know my place, Martha." "Do you?" The old woman's eyes were kind. "Because I've served 3 generations of princes, and I've never seen one look at anyone the way he looks at you." That evening, as the bells tolled for vespers, Clara slipped into the castle chapel. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and ancient stone wrapped around her like a comfort. She knelt in prayer, her heart heavy with thoughts she dared not voice even to God. The soft sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who had entered. Prince Leopold's presence filled the sacred space like incense, and he took his place in the pew directly behind her. Their prayers mingled in the candlelit silence. Though they did not touch, though they barely breathed, Clara felt the connection between them as tangibly as the rosary beads beneath her fingers. His whispered Latin echoed her own, their voices twining together in ancient words of devotion. The moment stretched like honey in sunlight, sweet and golden and suspended in time. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, the setting sun cast jeweled light across the stone floor, painting them both in the same holy colors. Dawn crept softly through the castle windows as Clara sat in the servants' kitchen, needle flashing in the early light. Young Thomas, one of the scullery boys, stood before her with tears still drying on his cheeks. His only jerkin had caught on a nail, tearing a lengthy gash down one sleeve. "There now," Clara soothed, her fingers working swiftly. "See how the stitches make it strong again. Sometimes the mending makes things better than before." She showed him where she had reinforced the worn cloth with tiny, even stitches. The boy touched the repair with wonder. "Can't even see where it was torn, miss. You've magic in your fingers, you do." "Cook," Martha bustled over, wiping her hands on her apron. "Our Clara has a gift, that's certain. Here, lad, take these rolls while they're warm." She pressed 2 fresh-baked rolls into Thomas's hands, ruffling his hair as he scampered away. But as Clara began to fold her sewing, Agnes, one of the chambermaids, drew her aside with worried eyes. "You should know what they're saying upstairs," she whispered. "The nobles, they call you. They say you're a temptress, using witchcraft to enchant the prince." Clara's hands trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin. "God knows my heart," she said softly. "That must be enough." That evening, at the formal dinner in the great hall, Clara's resolve was sorely tested. She stood with other servants along the wall, watching the gleam of silver and crystal as nobles dined. The Baroness Adelheide's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "Really, Your Grace," she drawled, addressing the Duke but pitching her voice to Carrie. "I find it most peculiar that we now employ church steps beggars as castle staff. What next? Shall we invite the pig keeper to dine?" A wave of titters swept the table. Clara felt her cheeks burn, but kept her eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly before her. Prince Leopold's chair scraped back sharply. "You forget yourself, Baroness," he said, his quiet voice carrying steel. "Those who mock honest work and Christian charity might question their own worth, not others." A charged silence fell. The Duke's face darkened like a thunderhead. "Son," he warned, "you overstep." "Do I, father?" Leopold's challenge hung in the air. "Or do we forget our duty to those who serve faithfully?" The Duke's hand clenched on his goblet. "Enough, we will speak of this later." Later that night, voices echoed from the Duke's private chamber. "Have you lost your senses?" the Duke demanded. "The Saxon alliance hangs by a thread. One false step, one hint of scandal, and years of diplomatic work crumble to dust. Would you risk war over some common girl?" "She is worth 10 of your scheming courtiers," Leopold replied, though his voice held weariness rather than heat. "She is nothing, a beggar you found on church steps. I forbid. You may forbid what you wish, father, but you cannot command my heart." The next morning, despite the tension thick in the castle halls, a messenger brought Clara unexpected news. She was to be elevated to official embroideress, with a proper chamber of her own rather than a servant's pallet. It was a modest room, but to Clara it felt like a palace, a small window, a narrow bed, even a table where she could work by candlelight. The prince insisted. Agnes confided, as she helped Clara move her few belongings. "Said your work was too fine for you to sleep in the servants' quarters." For a few precious days, hope bloomed in Clara's heart, like the first flowers of spring. Her new position gave her a measure of respect among the servants, and even some of the lower nobles began to notice the quality of her embroidery. But late one night, as she stitched by candlelight in her chamber, Clara's needle slipped. A bright drop of blood welled from her finger, falling onto the pristine white cloth. She stared at the spreading stain, her heart growing heavy with foreboding. The tiny crimson bloom seemed to whisper of sorrows yet to come. The autumn feast transformed the town square into a wonderland of color and sound. Red and gold ribbons fluttered from every lamppost, catching the late afternoon sunday. The scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced wine drifted through the crisp air. Market stalls lined the edges, their wooden boards groaning under the weight of harvest bounty. Scattered among the common folk in their Sunday best, nobles strutted in their silks and velvets like peacocks in a barnyard. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, fidgeting with the borrowed blue gown that the castle seamstresses had pressed upon her. Though clean and well made, it felt strange against her skin after so many months in rags. Her fingers traced the simple embroidery at the cuff, her own handiwork, added in quiet moments between her official duties. "You look like you're planning an escape," came a warm voice behind her. Clara turned to find Prince Leopold, his eyes twinkling with mischief despite his formal attire. "Your Highness," she curtsied, her cheeks warming. "I fear I stand out rather badly." "Indeed you do," he agreed, but his smile was kind. "Like a real rose among paper flowers." He glanced at the musicians tuning their instruments in the square's center. The violinist drew his bow across the strings, testing the tone. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Clara's heart stopped. "But the court," she whispered, seeing the shocked faces of nearby nobles. "Let them watch," Leopold said firmly. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her trembling fingers in his. The crowd parted like a wave as Leopold led her to the center of the square. The musicians, recovered from their own surprise, struck up a lively allemande. Clara's pulse raced as Leopold bowed, and she sank into a curtsy. Then his hand was at her waist, and they were moving. The first few steps were terrifying. Clara could feel hundreds of eyes upon them, some curious, some angry, some filled with quiet joy. But as the music swelled, the world began to fall away. Leopold's touch was sure and gentle, guiding her through the turns with perfect grace. Her borrowed skirts swirled around her ankles, and the cool autumn air kissed her flushed cheeks. "You dance beautifully," Leopold murmured as they turned. "Where did you learn?" "My mother," Clara answered softly. "Before she fell ill. We would practice in our kitchen, using a broomstick for a partner." His laugh was warm and genuine, drawing answering smiles from the common folk watching. As they began a second dance, then a third, Clara heard the townsfolk cheering. Children clapped along with the music. Even some of the younger nobles seemed caught up in the romance of it all. But not everyone shared in the joy. The Baroness von Krumm's face was twisted with disgust. The Duke, Leopold's father, watched from the castle steps with thunderous disapproval. Clara saw courtiers huddled in corners, whispering behind their fans. Yet for this one precious hour, none of it mattered. The music carried them away from titles and class, from duty and disapproval. In Leopold's arms, Clara felt truly seen for the first time since her parents' death, not as a beggar or a servant, or even as an embroideress, just as herself. As the sun sank toward the horizon, the first fireworks burst overhead in showers of gold and silver. The crowd oohed and awed, faces turned skyward. In the general distraction, Leopold drew Clara into the shadow of an ancient oak tree at the square's edge. "I should not have been so bold," he said softly, though his eyes held no regret. "But I could not bear to see you standing alone, looking so lovely." Clara's heart fluttered as his fingers found hers in the darkness. The touch was brief but electric, proper yet thrilling in its secrecy. Above them, the fireworks painted the sky in brilliant colors, reflecting in Leopold's eyes as he gazed at her. "No crown weighs more than this," he whispered, giving her hand one final squeeze before stepping back into the light of the square. Clara remained in the shadows for a moment, her hand pressed to her heart. For the first time since that morning on the church steps, she dared to believe that love might truly conquer all, even the seemingly insurmountable barriers between a prince and a penniless orphan. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as dozens of carriages rattled through the castle gates. The Saxon duchess's arrival had thrown the entire court into a frenzy. Silk gowns rustled and jewels glittered as nobles rushed to position themselves advantageously in the great hall. Through it all, Clara stood quietly in her corner, fingers trembling as she held her latest embroidery, an intricate scene of doves taking flight. The girl must present her work, the chamberlain had insisted. Her Grace wishes to see these remarkable pieces everyone speaks of. Clara's heart pounded beneath her modest brown dress as she waited. The hall buzzed with whispers and the scratch of feet on marble. Duchess Katharina swept in, her green silk train trailing behind her like a river of emeralds. The Duke and Leopold followed, the latter's face a careful mask that only Clara could read the tension beneath. "Come forward," the chamberlain called, gesturing to Clara. She approached with small steps, keeping her eyes lowered as protocol demanded. The embroidered cloth trembled in her hands. Just as she began to sink into a curtsy, a sharp voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Why do we waste her Grace's time with the handiwork of a beggar?" Baroness Helga emerged from the crowd, her rouge-painted lips curved in cruel triumph. This girl, this nobody was found sleeping on the church steps like a common vagrant not 2 months past. I saw her myself, curled there like a stray cat. The silence that followed felt like ice spreading across the hall. Clara's cheeks burned as dozens of eyes fixed upon her. Her fingers clutched the embroidery so tightly the threads strained. "Is this true?" The Duke's voice cracked like thunder. Clara could not lie. "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "My uncle's debts left me without enough." The Duke's face had turned purple with rage. He rounded on Leopold, who had taken an instinctive step toward Clara. "You knew of this?" "Father, her circumstances do not diminish her worth or her talent," Leopold argued, his shoulders straight and proud. "Her circumstances?" The Duke's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You would risk everything, our alliances, our very security, for a girl found begging on church steps? I forbid it. Renounce her now, or forfeit your inheritance." The hall erupted in gasps and whispers. Clara's vision blurred with tears as she watched Leopold's face contort with anguish. She could not bear to be the cause of his ruin. Before he could speak, before he could throw away his birthright for her sake, she turned and fled. Her feet carried her through familiar corridors now turned strange and hostile. In her tiny chamber, she gathered only her mother's thimble and a warm shawl. The rest, the fine threads, the comfortable bed, the dream of belonging she left behind. Her latest embroidery lay abandoned on her work table, the doves forever frozen in their attempted flight. Under cover of darkness, she slipped past the drowsy guards and into the town. The cobblestones were cold beneath her feet as she retraced the path that had led her here months ago. Her tears fell freely now, each one a goodbye to the happiness she had dared to grasp. The church loomed before her, its spire black against the star-strewn sky. Clara sank down on the familiar steps, her body curving against the stone as it had that first morning. How strange that she should end where she began, as if all the joy and warmth between had been nothing but a dream. The great bell began to toll midnight, each sonorous ring echoing her heartbreak. 1, 2, 3. She had lost not just comfort and security, but love itself. 4, 5, 6. The memory of Leopold's music, his gentle words, his defense of her before all the court. 7, 8, 9. The brief, beautiful belief that she could belong in his world. 10, 11, 12. As the final toll faded into silence, Clara pressed her face against her knees and wept. All was lost. She was alone again, with nothing but memories to warm the cold nights ahead. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to her grief, as she huddled once more on the church steps where her story had begun. The morning sun crept over the mountains, painting the town of St. Florian in shades of gold. Market women setting up their stalls paused their work, heads turning at an unusual sight. Prince Leopold, dressed in simple riding clothes, guided his horse through the crowded square. His fine bearing gave him away despite his plain attire. "Did you hear?" a baker whispered to her neighbor. "The prince seeks the missing seamstress, the one who fled the castle last night." The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, following Leopold as he moved through the streets. His eyes were weary, dark circles betraying a sleepless night. He had discovered Clara's empty chamber at dawn, finding only her wooden embroidery hoop left behind. Now he searched every shadow, every corner where a frightened girl might hide. "Your Highness," an old woman called out softly as he passed her cottage. "I saw her walking toward the river road before sunrise." Leopold touched his hat in thanks, turning his mount toward the path. The autumn wind whipped at his cloak as he rode, checking each inn and farmhouse along the way. At each stop, the same questions. "Have you seen a young woman, dark-haired, with gentle eyes? She works wonders with a needle." But each time, only shaking heads and sympathetic glances met his queries. By midday, he had searched the outlying villages. His horse's hooves kicked up golden leaves as they returned to town. The sun was sinking toward the mountains when a young boy tugged at his sleeve near the market square. "The lady who makes pretty pictures with thread," the child said, pointing toward the church. "She's there again, like before." Leopold's heart leaped. He dismounted quickly, tossing the reins to a nearby stable boy. His boots echoed on the cobblestones as he hurried toward the church steps where they had first met. There she was, curled up just as she had been that first night, her thin shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. Clara's face was tear-stained, her eyes red from crying through the night. "Clara," he called softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. She looked up, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Your Highness must go," she pleaded, her voice hoarse. "Please forget me. I cannot bear to be the cause of your ruin." But Leopold did not turn away. Instead, he knelt before her on the cold stone steps, just as he had done that first morning. Around them, townspeople gathered at a respectful distance, watching the scene unfold. "I will never leave you," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed square. "Not for a crown, not for an alliance, not for all the kingdoms of the earth." Clara shook her head, though her hands trembled. "But your father, the alliances, your duty—" "My first duty is to truth," Leopold interrupted gently. "And the truth is, I love you. Your noble heart and gentle spirit are worth more than any title." He took her cold hands in his warm ones. "These hands that create such beauty, this heart that shows such kindness, these are the treasures I choose." A murmur ran through the growing crowd. Market women wiped tears from their eyes, and even gruff craftsmen nodded in approval. From the church tower, the evening bells began to toll, their sweet notes filling the air. "The heavens themselves speak," an old priest remarked from the church doorway, making the sign of the cross. Clara's resistance crumbled under the weight of Leopold's unwavering gaze. "I love you too," she whispered, "though I tried so hard not to." Leopold rose, drawing her up with him. Then, before all the watching townsfolk, he lifted her into his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She buried her face in his shoulder, finally allowing herself to hope. "Look how he holds her," a woman sighed. "Like a treasure. Perhaps heaven truly does favor this match." Another responded, watching as Leopold carried Clara toward his waiting horse. The setting sun caught them in its golden light, casting a halo around the pair as Leopold held Clara close. The townsfolk crossed themselves, whispering prayers of blessing for the prince who chose love over convention, and the humble seamstress whose heart had won his own. The great audience chamber fell silent as Prince Leopold entered with Clara at his side. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. The assembled nobles drew back, their silk garments rustling with disapproval. Clara kept her eyes lowered, though her spine remained straight with quiet dignity. Duke Wilhelm sat rigid upon his carved throne, his face dark with fury. Beside him, the Duchess of Saxony watched the scene unfold with careful neutrality, her jeweled fingers clasped in her lap. The tension in the chamber grew thick enough to cut with a knife. "Father!" Leopold's voice rang clear and strong. "I present to you the lady I choose as my bride." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara's simple dress, though clean and proper, stood in stark contrast to the courtier's elaborate finery. A baroness near the front muttered something about church steps, loud enough for all to hear. "This is an outrage," the Duke began, half rising from his throne. "You would throw away centuries of noble breeding for a, if I may speak, your grace." A calm voice cut through the chaos. All heads turned toward an elderly woman in the severe black habit of an abbess. She moved forward slowly, her eyes fixed on the needlework Clara clutched in her trembling hands. "I am Abbess Magdalena of St. Catherine's Convent," she said, "and I recognize that embroidery pattern." Clara looked up, surprised, as the abbess gently took the fabric from her hands. The old woman's fingers traced the intricate design of roses and vines. "This is the work of Helena von Schönbrunn," the abbess declared. "I would know it anywhere. She was my dearest friend before she married against her family's wishes and was cast out." Color drained from the Duke's face. "Helena von Schönbrunn? The lost daughter of—" "Yes, your grace." The abbess turned to Clara. "Child, was your mother's name Helena?" Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "She taught me every stitch before she died. I never knew she came from noble birth. She never spoke of it." "She would not have," the abbess said softly. "Helena was too proud to beg forgiveness from those who rejected her love match, but her skill with the needle was legendary in her day. These patterns were uniquely hers, and now, it seems, they are yours." The chamber erupted in excited whispers. The Duke sank back into his throne, looking troubled. Leopold stepped closer to Clara, his hand finding hers. "It changes nothing," Clara said clearly, though her voice shook. "I never sought title or position. I only sought to survive with honor, to work honestly, and—" she glanced at Leopold, "to love truly." Her simple words rang through the chamber, silencing the whispers. Even those who had scorned her looked uncomfortable, perhaps seeing their own pretensions reflected in her genuine humility. The Duchess of Saxony rose gracefully from her seat. All eyes turned to her as she descended the dais steps. She stopped before Clara, studying her face. "I came here seeking a political alliance," the Duchess said, "but I find instead a lesson in what nobility truly means." She turned to address the court. "This girl slept on church steps rather than compromise her virtue. She worked with her hands rather than beg. And when she fled last night, it was to protect the prince's interests above her own happiness." The Duchess's cool gaze swept the chamber. "Tell me, my lords and ladies, how many of us can claim such nobility of spirit?" Duke Wilhelm shifted on his throne, the weight of all eyes upon him. His stern face softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at his son's unwavering stance beside Clara. "The alliance with Saxony," he began. The Duchess waved her hand dismissively. "There are other ways to secure peace than arranged marriages, your grace." Perhaps it is time we all learned to recognize true worth beyond accident of birth. A long moment passed as the Duke studied Clara. She met his gaze steadily, neither proud nor cowering. Finally, he gave a short nod. "So be it," he said gruffly. "The girl has proven her worth, both by birth and—" he paused, "by character." Leopold's face broke into a radiant smile as he pulled Clara close. The abbess beamed, tears in her eyes, while the Duchess looked on with quiet approval. "Perhaps," the Duchess remarked to no one in particular, "true nobility shines brighter through character than any title ever could." The autumn sun blessed St. Florian's Church with golden light that streamed through ancient stained glass windows. Every pew overflowed with townsfolk and servants, while nobles watched from their gilded galleries above. The air hummed with excitement and the sweet scent of fresh flowers that adorned every surface. In the vestibule, Clara smoothed her dress simple white wool, adorned only with her own delicate embroidery. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the small crown of white roses in her hair. The Abbess Magdalena stood beside her, eyes glistening with pride. "Your mother would be so proud, child," the abbess whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. "You carry her grace in every step." The organ's deep notes filled the church, and the heavy wooden doors swung wide. Clara's heart quickened as she took her first step down the aisle. The same faces that had once looked upon her with scorn now shone with wonder and joy. In the front pews, kitchen maids dabbed their eyes with aprons, while stable boys grinned openly. Leopold waited at the altar, resplendent in his formal attire yet wearing that same gentle smile she'd first seen on the church steps. His eyes never left her face as she walked toward him, and in them she saw the same tender promise he'd made that cold morning. "I'll keep you safe." When they joined hands before the priest, Clara felt the calluses on her fingers, marks of her needlework, meet Leopold's softer grip. Yet he held her hands as if they were the most precious things in the world. Above them, sunshine painted rainbow patterns through the rose window, blessing their union with heaven's own light. "I vow to protect you always," Leopold spoke clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. The words echoed his first whispered promise, but now they rang with the weight of sacred oath. Clara's voice trembled but held strong as she made her own vows, speaking of love, honor, and devotion. The priest raised his hands in blessing over their bowed heads. As he pronounced them, man and wife, the great bells began to toll above the same bells that had once marked Clara's lonely vigils on the steps below. Their joyous pealing seemed to make the very stones dance with happiness. When Leopold kissed his bride, the church erupted in cheers. The servants, who had become Clara's second family, wept openly with joy. Even the most stubborn nobles found themselves smiling at the pure love that radiated from the couple. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Clara and Leopold emerged from the church hand in hand. The square was packed with well-wishers, throwing flower petals and calling blessings. Clara paused at the top of the steps, the very place where she had once huddled, cold and alone. She looked at her husband, then back at the worn stones that had been her only refuge. "Safe, at last," she whispered, and Leopold's hand tightened protectively around hers. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while, subscribe, and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.